Real quick about our group, AWRA is dedicated to the advancement of water resources management, research, and education. Our members represent a community of water professionals with diverse backgrounds, sharing an engagement in solving some of the toughest water resources challenges, and the challenge we're talking about today certainly fits in with that. If you'd like to learn more about the Idaho chapter or AWRA, you can visit our website, awraidaho.org. We've in the last year, we've revamped the website. One of the things that we're really trying to push is the Idaho events calendar. So we have a calendar that has both events that Idaho section of AWRA is hosting, as well as other water resources related events. If you're part of an organization and would like to include your events on that calendar, please reach out and we'd be happy to include them on that. Moving on to today's presentation, we're excited to have Ralph Meyers with Idaho Power presenting. Ralph is an environmental manager with Idaho Power Company. His focus over his 30-year career with Idaho Power has been on relicensing the company's hydroelectric facilities in the Snake River. This has included the development and implementation of water quality mitigation programs. And today, Ralph will be specifically presenting on the Snake River Stewardship Program, a watershed approach to temperature mitigation. Ralph, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity to do this presentation. And my focus today is going to be on looking at the Snake River Stewardship Program as it relates to 401 certification and the relicensing process. Basically, the Snake River Stewardship Program it's a mitigation program to address and I think that you may try and today maybe look at how it worked within the regulatory framework. So with that, just a quick presentation outline. I want to talk about the regulatory and environmental context, and then a description of potential temperature mitigation options, describe the Snake River Stewardship Program as a solution within the regulatory framework, and then end it with just my thoughts and ideas on what I see as a few key elements that we learned from having a viable program, a viable watershed type program that works in the compliance arena. So just as a way of leading into this, the regulatory context, the original license for the Hells Canyon Complex was issued by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in 1958. It was a 50-year license, so that means it expired in 2005. The Hells Canyon Complex is made up of 3 individual dams and associated reservoirs. The photo on the right is Brownlee Dam, and that's the largest of the reservoirs. It's about 50 miles on Interstate 84. As you go down the hill into Farewell Bend, you'll notice the Snake River off to your right. That's the upper end of the reservoir. So from there, 50 miles downstream, going north, is where Brownlee Dam is. And then the middle photo is Oxbow Dam. That impounds water about 15 miles up to the tailwater of Brownlee Dam. And then it releases water into the backwater of the Hells Canyon Reservoir. And Hells Canyon Dam is the photo on the lower right. That reservoir is about 20 miles long, backs water up to the tailwater of Oxbow. And then when water leaves Hells Canyon Dam, it's about a 100-mile reach of the Snake River, the unimpounded Snake River, between Hells Canyon Dam and Lewiston. And the Lewiston area is where the river then flows into Lower Granite Reservoir, which is part of the Lower Snake Federal Complex. So, as of 2020, as of now, FERC hasn't issued a new license. So the way that works is, since the old license expired, we continue to operate the complex authorized under annual licenses, which practically is largely a continuation of the existing license on an annual basis. And one of the main reasons for delay in issuance so long after the license expiration date was that in order to issue a new license, FERC needs to get Section 401 Clean Water Act certification, which is issued by the states and basically certifies that continued operations of the project won't result in water quality violations or contributions to water quality violations. And so since this part of the snake and the complex itself is a boundary water between Oregon and Idaho, both Oregon and Idaho needed to issue 401 certification. And so there were, you have to look at the individual state standards because each one has to issue their own. And then temperature was one of the issues that held us up and that we had to work through. So we were successful in May of 2019 to get Clean Water Act certification from Oregon and Idaho. And a main part of that was that the water temperature concerns and issues associated with the mitigation proposals and the effects of the complex on temperature were resolved by the Snake River Stewardship Program. So just quickly looking at the temperature conditions that we see associated with the project, what this plot shows is temperature in the water flowing into Brownlee Reservoir, which again is the upstream-most reservoir of the complex. That's the dark blue solid line. And then the dashed pink line is water temperatures coming out of Hells Canyon Dam. So essentially the inflow compared with outflow. And then the red lines are on there just for comparison purposes. The one at 20 degrees relates to the 20-degree general cold water criterion that I think Oregon looks at. And then the red line down at 13 degrees is related to the salmonid spawning criterion that Oregon has. A 13-degree 7-day average max is the statistic. And what this shows is, the overall effect of the complex is because of the large volume of water that's stored behind the reservoirs, mainly Brownlee. The warming in the outflow occurs slower in the springtime than the inflow. As temperatures warm up, it takes longer for the large volume of cool water to heat up. The summer maximums are noticeably lower in the outflow than the inflow. And that's related to, again, a little bit of the delayed warming, but also the intake to Brownlee, from Brownlee Reservoir to the powerhouse is relatively deep in the water column. And so through the summer, it continues to pull a little bit of cool water out that has an overall cooling effect. And then in the fall, it's similar to the same thing that happens in the spring, except this is related to cooling, because you have a large volume of water that has accumulated a lot of thermal energy through the summer. It tends to cool down slower than the inflow does, just because it's not as responsive to the environmental conditions that are the cooling that occurs in the fall. And so relative to the standards and the criterion, the yellow box there indicates when the inflow is above that 20-degree cold water biota target. And you can see that the overall effect when you just look at the outflow versus the inflow of the Hells Canyon complex is it results in conditions downstream of Hells Canyon Dam that are more closely aligned with that 20-degree target. The magnitude of exceedance of the 20 degrees is not as big in the discharge. The duration of the time is not as big as in the discharge. And so basically in the context of 401 certification, the states determined that the net overall effect of the complex on water temperature conditions relative to the summertime was a net positive effect. So there was no mitigation required for that. Now, if you go to the fall, which is indicated by the red triangle, again, with the delayed cooling, you see that the inflow meets that 13-degree standard starting in late October when the salmonid spawning period starts. And that's driven in the Snake River by fall chinook that spawn in the river. That's the salmonid spawning that occurs below Hells Canyon Dam in the Snake River. And what it shows is that it's about for a 2-week period. So the late October, early November, the temperature and water leaving Hells Canyon Dam initially starts out at about 2 to 2.5 degrees warmer than the 13-degree standard, and then over that 2-week period tapers down to essentially meeting the standard. And that red triangle is the time period and the level of concern relative to that was a big factor in the 401 certifications. So just want a quick hit on the ecological conditions as well as the temperature conditions. That plot showed the conditions relative to the numeric criteria. This shows it's a picture of the Snake River near Marsing, so upstream of Brownlee back in 2002. And what you see there is there are a lot of white spots on the surface of the water, and those are dead mountain whitefish. That mortality was related to the high summer temperatures. So again, that the previous plot showed those high summertime temperatures, and what we've seen in the river upstream of Brownlee is temperatures are high enough that they can cause mortality to native species like mountain whitefish. And the plot on the right is just a graph of the temperatures that occurred during that time period. And you can see that, for about 2 or 3 days there, temperatures were up at 28.5, and on one day even pushed close to 29 degrees. So conditions that, there are temperature conditions that are clearly affecting the native cold water biota in the river. And then just the point of comparison relative to the red triangle that we talked about in the fall. The photo on the left is an aerial shot of fall Chinook reds in the river. So you can see the lighter puffy type areas in the river. Those are reds where the fish have come in and cleaned the bottom off, and so they show up as white areas. There's a extensive and very successful spawning occurring in the river below Hells Canyon Dam. And that's illustrated with the graph on the right, which looks at fall Chinook return numbers. These are counted at Lower Granite Dam. And you see that back in the early 1990s, so we start in 1990 on the left through 2019, but numbers were extremely low, and that's when the fall Chinook were listed under the Endangered Species Act. And then starting about 2000, in 1999, 2000, you see a real notable increase in return numbers that track through 2014, 2015. And this is, it was good news relative to the numbers of fish coming back. And a lot of that, we think, can be attributed to 2 activities, one being Idaho Power changed operations out of the Hells Canyon complex, out of table flows during the late part of during October and November, during the fall Chinook spawning time, when the fish are spawning there. We don't load follow anymore. Load following is when, as electrical demand increases or decreases, you can slow down the flow through the dam or increase it to create more or less power, generate more or less power. We don't do that anymore as a measure to protect the fall Chinook spawning. And also the other thing that occurred was the Nez Perce tribe initiated a hatchery program for fall Chinook back around at the time where you see the increases. It can be attributed to a lot of the increases. You see both increases in hatchery fish as well as native fish. And then unfortunately, the other thing that we are seeing recently is a decline in the numbers. I think that's, that doesn't isn't necessarily attributed to a change in fall Chinook spawning conditions in the river. I think, we're seeing that pretty typically among a lot of anadromous fish in the Columbia system. So as we look through potential mitigation options, there were 2 basic ones that came up and that we looked at. One was to use cold water from Brownlee Reservoir to manipulate the downstream temperatures. Basically selective withdrawal type structure or system where you could access cold water in Brownlee and move it downstream as it was a fairly reliable way to be able to hit the temperature, but I'll talk a little bit more about some of the issues associated with that. And then the other option was cooling the inflow water. So implement projects in the Snake River and tributaries that reduce thermal loading. So essentially our Snake River Stewardship Program that involved both in-channel in the Snake River and riparian enhancements. So as large-scale in-stream projects in the Snake River, and also then more classic riparian revegetation projects in tributaries. And so relative to the selective withdrawal structure, this is just a cutaway plot of temperature conditions in Brownlee Reservoir. In this case, this was late August, but this is typical through the summer, where the y-axis is actually feet, means sea level, but you can think of that as the dam. And then as you move upstream to the right, so from river mile 285 to 330, you have the Snake River flowing in on the right-hand side. The reservoir gets deeper. And in the deeper part, you have the blue indicates water that's probably around 5 or 6 degrees. So there is cold water in Brownlee that could be used for downstream flow or temperature manipulation. The issue associated with that, or one of the main drawbacks, and one of the main reason that this was not really our preferred alternative, was this plot is dissolved oxygen conditions on that same day, and looking at Brownlee Reservoir the same way. And so what you see is that cold water essentially has no oxygen. The red is less than 1 or 0 oxygen. And so pretty much good water quality characteristic of that water. Like the plot shows, it has no dissolved oxygen or very little. We've also measured, associated with that, elevated ammonia levels, elevated hydrogen sulfide, elevated methane, and elevated methyl mercury. So, you know, the concern there was the risk of using that water, passing it downstream, you know, especially during critical times like when fall chinook are spawning, and then the risk associated with these other water quality characteristics, not just temperature. So then getting to the upstream channel riparian enhancements, our Snake River Stewardship Program, you know, to evaluate the practicality or what the effects of something like that could be, we modeled the response of the outflow to cooling inflow temperatures. So we've got some C-Qual W2 models. It's a Corps of Engineers model that can look at temperatures through the reservoir and predict outflow temperatures. And what we did, the plot on the left shows 4 different scenarios, that inflow conditions that we ran relative to temperature for the complex. So the dark black line, that's baseline existing conditions. And then the dashed red line, what we did there was kept the conditions the same as baseline until they went above 19 degrees, at which point we just capped the inflow temperature at 19 degrees until then again in the fall, the temperature dropped below 19 degrees. And looked at ran that as an inflow condition. And then the other 2 lines below that was a little different approach, where we looked at what % reduction we would need in the maximum summer temperature to keep the temperatures below 19 degrees. And then applied with the green line, applied that percentage decrease year round to the temperature. So we were still estimating, saying that, you know, December, January, February temperatures would be cooler based on that percentage application to the measured temperature. And then on the gray line, did the same thing in the summertime, but tapered the decreases so that basically the temperatures were the same. So what we found there is that, you know, conditions definitely are affected by outflow, is definitely affected by inflow temperatures. If you look over on the right, which is the outflow from the modeling, you know, the black line, you see the basic measured data trend we saw, and then the dashed red line does decrease outflow summer maximum temperatures by some amount. There's not as much change in the tails, either the ascending or descending limb, because those temperatures weren't changed from baseline. The gray and the green line pretty much show that, you know, if you do something to reduce the inflowing temperatures and the spring and fall temperatures, it's going to have a noticeable effect on the outflow, to the extent where if you assume that inflow regime, if the inflows met that 19-degree standard, then the outflow would also meet the standard. But again, how you determine exactly what that inflow thermal regime is going to look like related to a watershed scale type proposal, there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of assumptions you need to make in there on that. And you can see that it, depending what assumptions you make, it does have a significant effect on your model results. The question comes in too, as far as model accuracy. We're looking at a 2-week period and trying to look for a 2 to 2.5 degree change on average. That's in a complex system. That can have a lot of uncertainty with it. And then along the lines of complexity, the inflow to Brownlee, if you look at the Snake River coming in as well as the small tributaries coming into the complex itself, it's about an 80,000 square mile watershed. And so there's a lot of activities going on outside of the Snake River Stewardship Program that you would need to make assumptions about and look at, and looking at what any change would be to the inflow conditions. And then also, we're planning for and hoping for a 50-year license here. And so not only do you have the large geographic scale of the watershed, but you have a relatively long time scale, which when you look at things like global climate change, things like that, those are all factors in what assumptions you make and how you determine what inflow condition you're going to have with implementation of a program like the stewardship program. And that is significant on looking at what effect that will have then downstream. So what we did, and I think appropriately did, and the way we were able to make this work given the uncertainty with some of the modeling is, we're going to implement measures upstream of the Hells Canyon complex that provide aggregate thermal benefits upstream that offset the downstream cumulative thermal load exceedance. And I know that, so what I'm going to do to try and explain those terms is run you through an example here of how that works. So this table shows measured data from a given year, one of the about 25 years that we have data for. And the excess C column just is the degree C above the criterion, the semi-spawning criterion, starting in late October, and then running through, in this case, on November 13th, the outflow would have fallen below or not exceeded the temperature criterion. You couple that with flow, so that's just CFS coming out of Hells Canyon Dam, and given that, you can calculate an excess billion kilocalories of thermal energy that's in the water during that time when the numeric criterion is not met. And so that arrow just indicates, so all we do is you add those numbers up and end up with 456 billion kilocalories is the estimate for that year of excess energy in the water because of the thermal conditions. So what we did was took the 25 plus years of data that we had, and so you have an individual number for each year, like the 456 in the example, and calculated a 90th percentile for all the years. And that turned out to be 541.6 billion kilocalories. Now there's a TMDL for that stretch of the river, a temperature TMDL, and that explicitly mentions a 10% margin of safety. So we added a 10% margin of safety to the 541.6, the 90th percentile, and came up with 595.8. And so that's the number that's the cumulative downstream cumulative thermal load exceedance that I mentioned up in the narrative header there. So that's at the outfall from Hells Canyon. But then since we're looking at a watershed proposal, we need to look at how do you track that through the reservoirs. So we did that with a combination of modeling and analysis. Like I mentioned, we have a water quality model CQualW2 that looks at flow of water through and water quality characteristics through the reservoirs. And then we also applied some multiple regression techniques to look at if you want to offset the 595.8 billion kilocalories in the outflow from Hells Canyon Dam, what does that mean relative to inflow? And when we looked at that, we found that the July through October thermal loading into Brownlee was one of the main driving factors or controlling factors for what the excess thermal load is in late October and November. And so we looked at the inflow July through October period, again, because that was seemed like the primary time. If you could change that, would then affect the downstream excess load. And when we looked at the modeling and the multiple regression, it essentially showed that we would have to double the reduction in the inflow to Brownlee in order to get the target discharge number. So the 1191.6 is essentially just 2 times the 595.8. And then, so from there, since our program is doing projects in the river upstream of Brownlee and also in the tributaries, for planning purposes, we just said, well, we're going to look at splitting half of that 1191.6 load in 2. Half of it would come from in-river Snake River projects. The other half would come from tributary projects. And so, again, we looked at some modeling. We had a C=W2 model for 1995 that when we did some sensitivity analysis there, analysis, excuse me, indicated that we would lose probably about 22% of the aggregate thermal load benefits. So aggregate being all the adding up all the individual projects in the river up there, we would lose about 22% of that. So we split that at 1191.6 in half, and then took that half and had to account for the 22% loss for projects in the river, Snake River itself. And then relative to tributaries, again, we started at half of 1191.6, but there was some modeling that Portland State had done on looking at the temperature effects of projects, and it was in the lower Boise, and how much of those benefits might be lost downstream of the projects. And that supported looking at a 25% loss in riparian tributary projects as they would relate to inflow to Brownlee. So that was the approach, and is the approach we took, and the approach that worked in the context of compliance for coming up with an appropriate offset target to address the thermal load exceedance below Hells Canyon Dam through tributary activities and proposals upstream. So the other component here, part of making this work, was being able to provide certainty and assurance that basically our proposal was feasible and could be done. So relative to the tributary riparian vegetation projects, and this is where I want to acknowledge the Freshwater Trust was key in helping us with looking at this. We went in and modeled conditions in tributaries between Swan Falls Dam and Hells Canyon Dam, and those are the yellow designations on the map show areas that we modeled to see what the potential thermal uplift. So basically, what was the potential for doing riparian projects that would result in a net reduction of thermal benefits, which is then your uplift. So the yellow parts are sections of the tributaries we modeled. You'll notice if you look at like the Powder River, which is in the upper left-hand corner there's a segment right where it comes out of Brownlee Reservoir that's not yellow, and that's because that's backwater from Brownlee Reservoir. And then if you go up between the two segments, yellow segments there's another section that's not yellow, and we excluded areas that were in canyon type topography, because in those situations you really can't get much benefit by putting riparian shade there, because you already have a lot of topographic shading. So we didn't include those areas. And then also you'll notice on the Powder, for example, the yellow stops, and there's still a lot of upstream stream area that's there. And what we did also was we limited the upstream boundary of the modeling to what we identified as significant reservoirs or dams in the system. And again, the concept there was, it's uncertain and hard to expect that you're going to be able to identify and get as many benefits from thermal load reduction if it has to go through a large reservoir. So those were the two main reasons or criteria for identifying where we wanted to model or not. We used the shadolator model, which is widely used by Oregon DEQ, and basically showed that the necessary reductions are available and at a level that we think is reasonably recruitable. Because the other part of this is, this is private land, and we don't have any ability to force anybody to participate if they don't want to. And so, the question is, well, what's the total available thermal uplift, and also, is it reasonable to think that you can recruit those landowners? And I think we were able to identify yes on both of those questions, and come up with some strategies and frankly incentives for why people would want to participate. So the summary there relative to magnitude of what the program would be is we think we're going to need over 100 miles of area that we would enhance with native riparian vegetation along those tributaries in order to meet the target for the tributary component. So people are fairly familiar. The tributary stuff is pretty standard, and you can see examples of this kind of thing. It's basically, this is a shot of a program that we implemented in 2017 on the Powder River. Again, this was it was prior to 401 certification, but it was key in supporting that what we had was a feasible program, and really illustrating that it could be done. We were out there and implemented a project. It was about a little over a third of a mile, 2,000 plants on the Powder. And you can see this is a good example of where there's a lot of opportunity for uplift here. Essentially, there's no shade and if we put in the native vegetation and get good riparian conditions there, there's going to be a lot of resulting benefit in reduced thermal loading. We also looked at the target for how wide you want that band to be, and found that 40 feet for this was probably right. If you made it narrower than that, then you start losing some of the benefits that you could get because your vegetation band is too narrow. If you start making it much broader than that, you really don't get a substantial amount of additional benefits. So we're targeting 40 feet wide on the riparian stuff. This is just another example of a feasibility project on the Weiser River. This one is smaller than the Powder River, but again, if you look at the pre-photo, which is on top, not a lot of opportunity for shade there. And this one's about a half acre in area, planted at about 700 plants. And then that photo on the bottom is another shot of it. This would be a year after we implemented. You can see the plants are there, but you can also, it's going to take a while for the plants to grow and really get you the shade and the results that you're looking for. But again, I think with these two projects were key and valuable in answering a lot of questions about the uncertainty of how practical this type of stuff was, and quite frankly, whether we could do it. The other component that I mentioned was the in-river channel work. And what this slide shows is it's a graphic of what we did in evaluating potential projects in the Snake River. So Panel A, which is the top one, about 5 to 8 miles upstream. And then the river is flowing right to left. It's got the Walters Ferry Bridge there. It flows on through to the left side of the panel and then wraps down to the bottom panel. So from the top left side of the panel A, go down to the bottom panel on the right side. That's the river flows into that and then continues flowing to the left down to home. And looked in this area for potential project areas that, and the main goal here is to deepen and increase velocity in the main channel of the river, And the river through this stretch has a lot of areas that are, they're not stagnant backwater, but they have very low velocity water going through them. They're shallow, they're dominated by macrophytes, areas that really are heating up from thermal loading that occurs in the summertime. And the idea is to take those areas, fill them in, and have them be functioning floodplain during higher flows, but during low base flows, that those areas now have riparian vegetation, that so you're no longer getting the thermal loading to the water in that area. And then also you're getting deeper, faster velocity water in the remaining channel. Basically, the concept is to size the river to fit the current flow conditions. The river was formed over hundreds of thousands of years, and it formed to the flow features that were there over that long time frame. Now the flow conditions are different, and it's basically looking at sizing the river to match what the current conditions are. And again, similar to the tributary evaluation, we went out and looked at the population of potential projects as we saw it. There were 57 out there. They have varying amount of potential uplift or benefit. So we're looking at probably needing 20 to 25 of these projects, depending on which ones we would implement and which ones we would pick in order to meet our compliance target. And as you might expect, a lot of the initial questions and very valid questions and views is, well, it's a great concept, but can you actually do it? The islands out there, most of them are part of the Deer Flat National Wildlife Refuge, so they're owned and operated by the Fish and Wildlife Service. The stream channel is owned by the state of Idaho. And also, any kind of a dredge and fill activity is regulated under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, so you need to get permission from the Corps of Engineers as well. So a lot of, concerns and regulatory hurdles. And so again, we launched into this project at Bayha Island in 2016, in large part, even though we didn't have the 401 and the proposal wasn't accepted at that point for regulatory compliance, to demonstrate that, yeah, we could do that. It was practical. And so we went through the process and got for actually doing the construction in 2017. And that's what's on the right-hand side. So the left-hand side is the island as it existed in 2012 prior to our project. And you can see on the upper left part of that, where the island narrows, there's a clear deposition area there, and a lot of vegetation below velocity water. The channel between the island and the main land on this areas are a lot of vegetation. That was relatively shallow, generally about 2 feet, and not a lot of velocity there. So part of the project was we went in and deepened that channel, narrowed that channel, so it's deeper, higher velocity, and then also increase the seasonal floodplain, which is what you see at low base flows in the summertime. During the spring, when we get flood flows coming down there, that area is going to flood and function just fine. And then when the water drops, you have seasonal floodplain with riparian vegetation on it. Now you can see that we did irrigate initially when we planted the plants, but that was just to get them started. We discontinued irrigation, and the plan is that these areas we create have to be self-sustaining in the environment that they're in. Our plan is not to go out and continue watering those areas. And part of this, we did some experiments with watering and not watering areas. And interestingly enough, at Bayha, there was no statistical difference between the watered and non-watered areas. But I think realistically, some of that is because of the individual year characteristics we just happened to have in 2017 post-construction. So again, a lot of work and a lot of effort to demonstrate that this was practical. The other part, the key part, is the program administration systems. And the thing I want to point out there and note on that is, this administration system will be a good way and a reliable way for people to go look at what projects have we implemented, what do they look like, where are they, what did we do, and then a monitoring summary of what is the result of that. Basically, a reliable regulator confidence, ensure that projects are realistic and can be implemented because you're tracking, what you're doing, and along the lines of their performance and progress tracking, and then making the reporting and the whole program in general transparent and accessible. They need to make sure that folks can go look at it and verify that you did what you said you were going to do and that it's working. So this is a key element. And again, I want to call out the Freshwater Trust specifically here and their support and help on this, and their perspective in making sure that we understood how important the transparency and accessibility of information and data was. And then along the same lines, there'll be a place where you can go and look at a graph like this over time and see where are we relative to our compliance trajectory. Are we on track? Is it reasonable to think that we're going to get there in 30 years? And also be able to look at how are those benefits split between the in-stream and the riparian projects. Again, a way to just make sure that we're addressing the need for transparency, visibility, and being able for folks to be assured that what they expected is what's being delivered and that we're on track. So just quickly here to wrap up and leave time for questions. Just put together a few key elements that came to my mind in thinking through what is important when you're looking at a watershed program relative to a compliance purpose. One of the things that's key is a defensible targets to meet the compliance obligation, and that comes back to the slide and explanation on how we defined our targets and our obligations. And there's obviously always going to be some level of uncertainty in how that's done, but I think being able to try and be as clear and be able to communicate the assumptions and what you did and how you did it is key, and be able to come up with defensible targets, and having defensible targets is a key part of a compliance program. And then strong support and demonstration of feasibility. And we spend a lot of time and a lot of money on doing some of those early implementation, what we were calling research projects, as a way to really document that we could do it, and that it was feasible. And I think that that's a key part if you're looking at trying to do something like this in a regulatory environment. Having defined quality standards, I didn't really touch on this in this presentation, but we have written documented quality standards that we're designing those projects to, that again give certainty that if you're looking at implementing this over a 30-year period and a lot of different projects, that those projects are going to be done in a credible and a way that's going to give you the best chance that they'll be successful. And that's I think it's really important to have quality standards, and we do. And then the transparent and viable actions and reporting. Again, that's we outlined what we plan to do, and we are going to have a system where folks are going to be able to go out and look and say, okay, well, where are you relative to that, and really confirm relatively easily whether we're on track and doing what we need to do for compliance. And then the other part is it's very helpful to have a clear demonstration that environmental benefits outweigh risks. I mean, the idea that go back to the example, we looked at potential selective withdrawal, and I mentioned some of the risks associated with moving that cold water downstream, and then look at a watershed proposal where there's some level of uncertainty on exactly what that's going to do to temperatures downstream and in the Hells Canyon discharge. But the environmental benefits of upstream watershed programs are fairly clear in my mind, and that was a really key component to getting support from different agencies, like specifically Fish and Wildlife Service. You need to acknowledge that there is some uncertainty and risks around a watershed scale program, just because of some of the modeling things and other items I talked about. But if you're delivering clear environmental benefits, that was important in my mind for us. And then just the stewardship and monitoring. We're going to build those, we're going to construct those projects, but we're not just going to walk away from them. There's a commitment to monitor those and maintain them as needed for the duration of the license. Now, the goal is to create systems using natural vegetation and the features at the site, so that the maintenance is minimal, but we're not just going to build them and walk away and say we're done. There's a key component relative to compliance, I think, is the stewardship and monitoring. So with that, if I'm looking at my time right, we're about 10 minutes or 12 minutes. I'd be willing to take questions if anybody has any. Thank you so much for being willing to listen.
Thank you, Ralph. I'd invite anyone, if you have questions, to type those questions into the chat window, and we'll try to get to those as they come through. Looks like Steve Clayton has a question, including for tributary riparian plantings at the Bayha projects. How are invasive species being managed, and what is long-term O&M game plan if projects are intended to be self-sustaining? Ralph, would you like to talk to that question?
So the invasive weeds are they are a big maintenance issue that we have to address. Obviously, in a river like that, you're getting a lot of seeds that either come downstream or blow in from other places. So we did, on that project, we did some pre-construction spraying, weed maintenance, and then did construction, and have continued to do weed control. The one that's significantly hard is salt cedar in that area. So we're doing spraying and physical pulling on an annual maintenance basis. Trying to get to the point where the native vegetation will at some level control the weeds. But I think the expectation is that it will never be totally maintenance free. As far as the salt cedar, we continue to look at and are hopeful that maybe some biological controls, like the beetle, which is used in other parts of the region, might be a viable control for salt cedar. So an ongoing issue that we're continuing to look at how we can manage that, and that includes use of biological controls, herbicides if necessary, physical pulling. But that's a component that is part of our planning.
Thanks, Ralph. On a related note, on kind of O&M and long-term sustainability of those projects, I had a question. I was wondering what kind of evaluation you've done related to geomorphic impacts of some of these islands. It looks like there are areas where intentionally the channel was narrowed and deepened. Have you been monitoring kind of the geomorphic response, either scour on the island or deposition upstream and downstream? And I was just wondering what your plans are long term to monitor, evaluate, and manage channel morphology.
Yeah, and so at Bayha specifically, we have been doing annual monitoring of bathymetry in the area, basically to ensure and see what changes there has has been in substrate moving, relative to the different flow conditions. And I think, in my understanding, what we found is that things are fairly stable. I mean, you're obviously going to get certain depositional areas at the base of the island with sand and type things moving downstream, but we've found that the features that we designed into the project have been fairly stable, and that's through annual monitoring. Now, on the long term, I think the level of monitoring that we'll do and need to do kind of depends on the results of what we find with some of these early projects. If we start seeing a lot of change and a lot of movement, that's, I guess in my mind, it's a river system. You expect some of that. There, you don't necessarily want a total stable situation, but on the other hand, we don't want to get into a situation where we're seeing everything we did just go away. And it's been really encouraging, given the annual monitoring of both depth and velocity, channel morphology that we've done every year at Bayha, and plan to continue to monitor that as necessary, to answer that question in the future.
Great. Thanks, Ralph. Questions are starting to pour in. What I'll do is I'll read them off as they come in, and we'll take as many as we can between now and the top of the hour. I got a question from Brian Limming. Do the models used account for evapotranspiration of the revegetated riparian areas? And if yes, what effects are projected on river flow?
Yeah, both of those we think are, whether it's any cooling effect or effect on river flow, is insignificant.
Okay. Next question from Martin. The amount of riparian restoration needed to supply sufficient shading seems enormous and costly. Has there been any consideration of directly reducing warm water inputs by addressing agricultural practices, i.e. reducing flood irrigation return flows, putting ag land into conservation easements, etc.?
Yeah, we did. I mean, we did look at that at some level, and I think the conclusion there was that, as far as looking at costs and feasibility of doing those kind of activities, was not any more viable, effective, or preferable to what we're looking at doing in the Snake River Stewardship Program. We are, kind of as a side note to that, we are doing programs or efforts to convert furrow irrigation to sprinkler as part of, and it's a water quality improvement program, but it's related to dissolved oxygen conditions in Brownlee. So we are looking at, not necessarily from a temperature perspective, but being, funding and encouraging people to convert from furrow irrigation to sprinkler as a way to reduce nutrient and sediment loading to the river. And also that works really well to do those kind of activities upstream of our in-stream projects, because the concern was, if we go in and clean the substrate, rework the substrate, get it in a good condition, but you have that excess sediment coming in from, say, non-point sources upstream, it's not going to be a long-term benefit. You're going to eventually, fairly quickly, if it's a lot of loading, lose the habitat benefit to the stream substrate. So we are doing some of that, not necessarily as part of the Snake River Stewardship Program. So.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Next question from Ryan Carney. How is the effectiveness, monitoring, and reporting at Bayha informed the next and future Snake River in-channel design?
Yeah, so we were scheduled to construct another project just a little bit downstream of Bayha this fall, and unfortunately we had a glitch in the schedule because of permitting. And so I guess one of the main informing factors of Bayha was what needs to be involved in the permitting part of things. some of the ones that we initially identified, we were able to address and have improved the process with the second island. Unfortunately, it came down to a gravel source permit that delayed us for a year on the next one. We are, based on our experience at Beha, we're going to manage with no irrigation on the planting on the second island, which is Rippy downstream. And I think just so some of those, the actual construction techniques and, the value of being able to say source gravel that we need locally. That was an important thing that we worked through on the first project. The vegetation, we put some mats, some more like the emergent wetland mats on the fringes of our newly created floodplain. Those did not do well in 2017. So I think it was, like looking at being able to identify what vegetation works in what areas, what makes sense to do and what doesn't. Those are some of the things that come to mind as far as lessons learned and how we apply those to the next project.
Okay. Our next question from Steve Clayton again. What incentives are being offered to private landowners, and how has that influenced their willingness to participate? What changes might be implemented going forward based on lessons learned with incentives thus far?
Yeah, so we do enter into lease agreements or agreements with landowners where we compensate them for the land that essentially they are allowing for management that's going to meet our needs. So there's some monetary compensation there. The other opportunity that we're using on the Powder is the irrigators over there were interested in looking to make some improvements to Thief Valley Dam. And they were interested in looking for partners that could help them with that if they got to the point where they would be doing that. And what we did is we offered to be supportive of them in those efforts if they got to that point. And what we asked was that they would work with us in implementing our program. So, I guess, in general, the approach is to continue to look for creative ways where we can find common interests and align, and then, at some level, classic monetary compensation for, them changing management practices on the riparian areas.
Okay, thanks, Ralph. It looks like we have one more question, and then if we have time, I'd like to have Maureen Hodgkins talk about a project she is going with the University of Washington. Let's get to our last question first, and then we'll go to the survey topic. The last question is from Martin Koenig. A reminder that IDFG holds several fish and boating access sites and properties in the preferred restoration area. Have you approached regional staff to determine if a mutually beneficial project could be developed on IDFG managed property?
We have, part of our outreach, we have had discussions with Idaho Fish and Game staff. I don't believe we've had specific discussions about specific projects or areas specific to those individual parcels of land that would be owned and managed by Idaho Fish and Game.
Great. Thank you, Ralph. Ralph, if anyone has any follow-up questions, I'm assuming they could reach out to you either via email or phone and get answers to those follow-up questions. Is that right?
Yeah, you bet. I appreciate the opportunity to present. Yeah, so my email is R as in Ralph, and Meyers, it's Meyers only one E in it, at idahopower.com. And my number, if you want to call me and discuss things, it's 208-559-2573.
Great. Thank you, Ralph, and we really appreciate you taking the time to put this presentation together and to present to the group. It was certainly an informative presentation, and we certainly look forward to hearing about the success of the Snake River Stewardship Program as you implement it.
Well, thank you, and yeah, I appreciate the opportunity.
Lastly, if people are not in a hurry to get off, I'd like to turn it over quickly to Maureen Hodgkins, who has would like to ask for some assistance on a project with the University of Washington. Maureen?
Hi. Yeah, hi. Thanks everyone for letting me have a few minutes of your time. I've put in the chat box a little bit about the project, but basically we're looking for water sector folks who want to discuss planning under extreme precipitation and drought. And the work will be done by the University of Washington in July and August. And if you're interested in this topic, please go to the survey link in the chat. It's a real quick survey, and you can tell us specifically what you're interested in. And then in July, focus group calls to see specifics about what folks are interested in. And then in August, to respond to those interests, we'll have some webinars about using websites and data sets from places like the National Weather Service, drought.gov, river forecast centers, and the websites that provide snow information. And we'll also have some case studies about organizations that have successfully planned using that data. So it'll be a bit to come on using these data sets. And we really hope, if you're interested in this, you can help us out with us and participate in the survey. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Maureen. I had one quick question on that regarding the target audience for the request. Are you looking specifically for representatives of utilities, or
Yeah.
more broadly for professionals in the industry?
We could do both. I think we were trying to target the not large water utilities, and realizing that there's, often we'll hire out to consultants, and then also local government agencies. All of these sectors would benefit from this kind of little practicum and training.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Maureen. Again, Maureen put the link for the survey in the chat box. So if you'd like to, take a few minutes and reply to that survey, that would be a great help. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for calling in and participating in our webinar today. Real quickly, our next webinar, we just picked a date and a time for it, and our webinar will be a webinar on some dam breach modeling of the Teton Dam failure that Hannah Spiro, who is a rising senior at Boise State University, some research that she's been involved in. She presented her work at the ASFPM, the Association of State Floodplain Management Conference, just a week or two ago, and won the student paper contest. So we're certainly excited to have a young rising professional in the water resources industry get that recognition. Someone from Idaho doing research on an important topic here in the state. So that webinar will be July 8th over the lunch hour, and you will be seeing information from Idaho AWRA on that shortly. Again, thanks everyone for participation today, and look forward to seeing you or participating with you on our next webinar. Have a great day.